These cards are pack filler and won't be justified in any deck, even casual ones. The multi-element down units are cool for limited though. I put this card in its own slide because what the actual heck is this even doing in Opus 13? This is barely passable in Opus 1, even if Nostalgia existed at the time. Did they just forget to print an entire line of text or something? These are outdated archetype support. The haste one is potentially mildly useful for Refia, but it's still the power level of an Opus 1 backup, and being on color doesn't solve that underlying problem. The cycle of summons is decent overall. 4 out of 6 base EXs are good. Leviathan Space Case is actually pretty good as a card cast. Odin Bahamut work well with the damage 5 trigger since instant speed removal spikes in power and usefulness when it's protecting you from an opponent's victory push. Shiva is similar, but it's in a worse element. Dryad is a use case that hasn't existed until this set. Bahamut is also the first potentially efficient summon for Moody's trigger. Alex is pretty much the only unplayable one. These are cute, and they're probably closer to playable than a lot of other monster cycles, but they are still a bit outdated. 1CP 7k has been the vanilla line for a while now without needing damage 3. Ochi is the only potentially viable one for being -1 cost instead, and adding casts / triggering Barrel Eye and Hope. It's also category 8, which may become relevant later. On that note, these cards are good support, but for bad archetypes. Renoa in particular is an excellent support card, even with the worst name. Onion Knights probably won't ever be playable unless we get a backup that bypasses their name clash, but we can dream. These cards are good support, either for cards that don't exist or themes that don't have enough competitive cards yet. Lid can't quite hit the ratios yet without a meaningful deck building cost. Selfie will be good once there's a multi-element forward in fire that spikes with haste. FFBE is too thinly spread for Fina. Viking doesn't have enough Vikings to be more than a high roll card. Engineers have a good start, but I don't have high hopes of getting anything more. These two occupy a very unfortunate space. Sid Randall's effect is clearly excellent, but it's attached to such an awful, inefficient body that you just lose if they have any removal outside forward enters, which is actually not that rare currently. Remedy suffers as a result. The card is pretty cool and especially interesting as a march target, but it requires Sid Randall both in your list and actually still in your deck when she triggers, which are both harsh conditions. These two are hard to evaluate. I get the feeling they have a use somewhere, but I can't really find it. Both have a decent ceiling, but they require dedicating an amount of deck slots to light and dark, which is getting worse and worse, especially when multi-element cards are a similar power level without the massive drawback. If nothing else, Spiritus provides more ways to play Neo early, but there are actually heaps of those already, which don't block your hand, making it hard to protect him. These cards all support the two summon-based themes, which are lots of summons and free big summons. The lots of summons theme has the huge inherent issue that summons themselves won't actually deal damage to your opponent. And the more summons you include to fuel these effects, the less bodies you have to actually win the game with, to the point that even if you're gaining all this efficiency, you can't convert it to a winning position. That's not to say something like Doka is a bad card, it's got a good ceiling, just requires careful deck building decisions. Free big summons usually involves off-color cards and combo cards that are blank otherwise, and are usually non-neutral, so may not even be usable if you do have the combo available. Rydia is actually pretty cool, but it massively suffers from Fenrir's popularity. These cards I'm classing as theoretically cool because they have interesting effects and potentially a good payoff, but they're hard to find space for in a deck. Mid is the other card like Dryad that introduces instant speed, non-telegraphed protection from abilities. Vanilla is like a monster that dies to forward removal, including most of the good removal played currently, which is an awful place to be, but the deferred nature of its first effect gives us something over Kusith. Skarm is the most interesting back attacker we've seen, with a combo effect that we haven't seen until now. L is really cool if she's actually resolving. It's just not going to happen reliably, especially with the aforementioned thin spread of FFBE, even if she gets to attack. Jake suffers from multi-element casting conditions without multi-element level payoff, while Bunnyvels is as close as we'll get to a playable stat stick. Kane is blatant RNA support, also other revival like Zemus and Gilgamesh 11, problem being those cards' issue isn't a lack of good targets. For cadets, I'll just repeat what I wrote on Facebook or thread a while ago. Hobby Japan are trying too hard to make it as awkward as possible to build. The best forwards are all in fire, but the backups are all wind. Yet 9 needs lightning forwards, but Queen is the only good one, and she wants to be played last. So you're forced into tricolor, but there are no dual color Moogles for these elements, and Earth isn't one of them either. Ace and 9 are actually great support, and Sync has an excellent payoff, but you have to play some awful names to reach it. You'll probably never play this Cater, purely because the existing Cater is already the only fire cadet backup. These multi-element cards are all good on paper, they just require specific decks which aren't quite as simple to approach as others. Yuzuki in particular reads well but feels hard to play, while Lastor doesn't read that well, but after playing it does seem pretty good. Kunshiri is mindless aggro with a much fairer costed special than Ilua. Ultimisha is a non-multi thaumaturge with added utility. In hindsight, Hope is probably misplaced here as it's an easy inclusion in Icewind, which is already established. I'm just sad that its first ability is hard to benefit from, however, its second ability more than justifies the card alone. Now we're getting to more interesting stuff. Starting with the medium legends. These are reminiscent of older designs. Lednar is pretty good overall with some cute synergies, but it's in a bad color combination. Axstar is solid in the right list when live, but it's a bit unreliable. Behemoth K is incredible in the exact scenario you want it, but it's hard to justify otherwise. If anything, Behemoth K most suffers from the existence of many damage 5 power spike effects, and it's the first card enforcing the new gameplay detail. Do not put your opponent to 5 until you win. These are all just backups you play if they fit your deck. Besides that, Alchemist and Red Mage give a second Writ Searcher in their respective colours, and Quistis provides a backup name for a Noah. That's about all there really is to say here. These are good support for archetypes that are already established. Sharis shares the same problem as Lednar, being in the wrong colours, but it's good when it's live. Palom is a good new Magista trigger, and Rain is just a solid card for any modifier deck, and it also consolidates spare Magista triggers into removal if she's not around. Yang is the only way a card like Matt could be playable, and while I realise calling Monks established might sound weird, it's honestly not a bad theme, it just lacked a good payoff until now, which we'll see later. Dragoons remain a potent aggro deck, which seem to get a new real card every set, and the main issue remaining is having to play bad Dragoons for numbers, so every time we get an upgrade like this one, it's a meaningful improvement. This is my selfish slide, as these are cards which benefit my deck specifically. Golbez in particular is a huge buff for loop decks since it provides an EX searcher for the pieces that were unsearchable before, and it gives a better payoff for Tyro than just Rainbow Earth backup with EX. Pavlov is a natural fit, although it doesn't specifically enable any loops. Gudon is 1 deck slot for 2 damage, which facilitates the win condition with less dedication, and being the correct dual CP as a bonus. Charlotte is a big buff to the Cloud combo, a lot of the time acting as a cheaper on-color Restoler, while Deleter adds great recursion to both Cloud, Charlotte, and even Yazoo, while once again conveniently providing the correct dual color CP. These are generic good cards for their element. Notice that from 4 out of 6 are fire cards. Zand is pretty crazy on paper. It's an improved VV, which also gives you damage, and I have to make it clear that that is a benefit, not a drawback. Lycacious is like a cheaper Death Gaze, which is harder to kill. But the only drawback that you lower your effective backup count to 4 instead of 5, which is not a big deal, especially when the card which cares, which is Rain, still sees 5. Rubicante is just a solid forward at damage 3 and makes combat very awkward for your opponent, although watch out for Kuchulain, which has shot up in usefulness and popularity of the set. Cecil is both a good generic forward and solid spot removal in an element that usually lacks both. Lightning is decent all round, filling different roles depending on the situation, but it's especially nasty with Kuchulain or Althea to dodge the drawback when used as removal. Aldor Emperor is a hyper-flexible removal on a stick, enough that one of the modes will always be good, and the body is at the important power threshold of 9k. This will come up more as we go, but if you look at damage values on effects, a huge percentage cap at 8k, while the higher values are usually treated as just big value at like a meaningful cost jump. These cards are actually a pretty good engine. This is exactly what Cadets are not. A turn 1 backup solves the rainbow color problem, and there's 2 good searches for it, while both backups also fix their outdated boss monster by reducing its cost. The ice one is what Veritas wishes it was, while both it and the searcher forward are the correct cost for full value X-Death. Even the lesser 2 forwards are pretty good, but the best part is that they're all multi-unit, which make the theme run much smoother than many others. Overall, it's a nice solid engine. All it really lacks is a high CP payoff. This card came out of nowhere. Avelia was a mildly interesting spoiler, but it came with the question, would they actually release good enough FFT forwards to justify it? And boy, did they deliver. Most people realize straight away how insane value Agrius is with Avelia in play, but just to be clear, it's effectively a 1 CP 9k that kills a 7k on entry, and it's also a +1 EX. So this minor package might have single-handedly made Water a generic competitive element again outside of Zainchi's. Unfortunately for the new Ramza, he's not really worth playing since there's an older, superior Ramza with a very high ceiling, who was waiting for a good generic high-cost FFT forward, which we have now thanks to Agrius. Rafa and Marak are too fair for Opus XIII. In particular, I have no idea why Marak lets your opponent choose, and that makes it so much worse, such that it will probably never do what you need it to do. So all you need to care about regarding FFT is that Avelia Agrius with the Opus X Ramza is a solid minor engine with plenty of support, like Thancred and Lightning and Kuchulain are in the same element combination too. For the record, it's probably the best Chantodalist deck I've played in Opus XIII, which is saying something when Fire continues to get competitive support. This is also the deck that cements my earlier point of do not put someone to 5 damage unless you win, because this deck spikes massively at damage 5. Now we have the good generic legends, or in Nimbus's case, excellent. Nimbus is the new best generic neutral in the game, being effectively a 2-cost 9k generator. Not much else to say other than if your deck can support it, you play it, and if not, it might even be worth tweaking the backups in any Ice or Earth deck just to fit it in. Fistless is just a solid ice forward, which is something Ice sorely lacks recently, and its stellar special is icing on the cake. Pun not intended. Celestia is actually an insane effect, especially on the ice side. It's just hard to find a good approach to support its element combination, but if you can though, it will put in a lot of work. Now for the star of Opus XIII. Sophie is one of those rare cards that basically everyone sees and wants to build a deck around, whether they're casual or competitive. The sad reality, however, is that Hobby Japan tried too hard to directly push it, which is a shame, as I actually really like the card itself, its design, which could have led to some interesting creative approaches if they didn't print such perfect direct support. So Sarah Mobius is pretty much what you'd end up with if you asked what is the best possible Water Earth card to buff my Sophie by 4k, and Nicole is unnecessarily ideal alongside them both. This extends to the support that already exists. Lena and Fenrir are two of the most efficient revival effects, which both Sophie and Sarah fit exactly into. Sarah even gets an unconditional neutral effect to back up her unnecessarily powerful removal effect, meaning she will always be a good play no matter the situation. Contrasting Sophie to Necron is just insane. It's like they were hyper careful last set to make direct damage difficult to achieve. They completely flipped and made it trivial. They made it cheap, and they slapped a draw on top just to make sure there's no drawback for playing into it. The amount of pressure Sophie and her friends generate with zero investment makes March Ritz look tame, and the zero investment is of course the biggest advantage, because outside of very specific degenerate strategies, FFTCG is never about doing something your opponent can't stop. It's about doing things efficiently enough that if your opponent does stop it, they come out behind. While I'm on this slide, I do want to say as a side note that Graph is just bad and you probably shouldn't play it, even if you want extra Mobius for Wall. On that note, Wall isn't even necessary. It's just a good generator that fits into Fenrir and acts as another single forward 4k buff for Sophie. And lastly, I should mention that Sophie makes Ursula way better. As I alluded to earlier, Ursula is actually a good card. It just lacked a good enough target to pay off until now. I gave this card its own slide because it's so relevant and extends to multiple other slides at once. As we know from Noshtalan, any backup that searches other backups is invaluable, so it's already a good card for that reason, but also it has some hyper-relevant searches that unnaturally boost the consistency of the relevant decks. The most important one is, of course, Princess Sarah. To put this into context, Water now basically has a Camelot Chaos which requires no investment multiplier backups, only one light or dark card. This not only severely boosts the consistency of dual color decks, it enables a lot of third color shenanigans, whether that be a tech card or two, a minor splash, or a full-on third element, depending which dual color Moogles are available. In particular, Water Earth also has the aforementioned Tyro and Chantoto, meaning that Water Earth can basically splash whatever it wants, and that just happens to be Sophie's element combination, which she already had plenty going for her. As for the other royals that you can search, the other super relevant one is, of course, Avelia, to the extent that you don't even need to invest in Jegrin to reliably find it and turn on Agrius. And I didn't mention yet that it can't just search backups, it can also search forwards, because it can search Lena and Ash. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many good royals that I can't talk about them all. As a quick list, we've got stuff like Althea and Fiona, Alice, Rampare, King of Amisha, Kolka, Regis, Epitaph, King Tycoon, even weird stuff like Edward. Simply put, this is probably the most flexible backup in the game in terms of deck building now. And the last slide is cards I just couldn't find a place for anywhere else, which aren't strictly bad, they're just hard to place or evaluate, except Barbarisha, who basically exists to make Golbez auto-win when it resolves, because you get another Golbez now. Cagnazzo similarly only really seems to exist to gain 3 counters at that time that you resolve Golbez, although outside of that you could play it with Onion Knight and spam its action ability for counters. Leo in particular is very hard to evaluate on paper, and it's the opposite of Sophie in that respect, because building around it is not linear at all. It needs some amount of dedication and support, but how much is not really clear, as it spikes at like a pretty low FFCC count. Perhaps my favourite thing about it is the potential for a Bast deck that doesn't go all in or full aggro, but that might not be the right approach either. Chime's main selling point is that it gets both of Celestia's buffs, and its effect isn't bad, it just fluctuates a lot on how good it is at any given time. Null is a cheaper version of the classic, cheesy kill card, but it's also a haste giver, which is always worth a look due to how many forwards spike with it. Cheers.